The morning light filters through curtains, finding two people in that quiet space between dreams and the day ahead. One reaches for their phone, types a message, and sends it into the world. What seems like a simple good morning can be so much more. Carl Jung once wrote that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Morning messages, these first communications of the day, operate in this liminal space where the unconscious still lingers close to the surface. They reveal aspects of ourselves we might not fully recognize. Consider the man who wakes to find a thoughtful message waiting. Something stirs within him, not just attraction but recognition. Jung would call this resonance with the unconscious. The words have touched something deeper than conscious thought. But what creates this resonance? What transforms ordinary morning communication into something that creates psychological obsession, or more accurately, profound connection? The first message that creates this depth touches the archetype of recognition. I was thinking about what you said yesterday about your father. That showed real courage. This isn't flattery, it's witnessing. In Jungian terms, it acknowledges the hero's journey, the struggle toward individuation that each person undertakes. How often do you feel truly seen, not for your achievements or appearance, but for the internal battles you fight? The psychological truth is that we hunger for this recognition more than almost anything else. The second message that creates depth appeals to what Jung called the shadow, those parts of ourselves we hide or haven't fully integrated. I love how passionate you get when you talk about things that matter to you, even when you think it might be too intense. This message says, "I see your fullness, even the parts you're uncertain about." Many relationships remain shallow because they operate only on the level of the persona, Jung's term for the social mask we wear. But psychological intimacy requires acknowledgement of the shadow elements. When a morning message creates space for these aspects, it creates an opening for authentic connection. The third message addresses potential. "I'm curious about your thoughts on..." This engages what Jung called the transcendent function, our capacity to evolve and integrate opposing aspects of ourselves through dialogue. By inviting thought rather than simple reaction, this message creates space for growth. Ask yourself, when was the last time someone invited your deeper thoughts, not your opinion or reaction? There's a profound difference. One treats you as a finished entity, the other recognizes you as a becoming. The fourth message that creates psychological fascination acknowledges vulnerability, yours, not just theirs. I felt nervous sharing that story with you yesterday, but your response made me glad I did. Jung believed that meaningful connection happens when we risk showing our authentic selves. This might seem counterintuitive. Conventional thinking suggests strength attracts, weakness repels, but psychological truth is more nuanced. We connect most deeply with those who demonstrate both strength and the courage to be vulnerable. The fifth and perhaps most powerful morning message creates what Jung would call synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. I saw this article and immediately thought of our conversation. This message says, "Our connection exists beyond our direct interactions. You occupy space in my mental world, even when we're apart." Think about the last time someone shared something specifically because it reminded them of you. There's an affirmation in this that goes beyond compliments. It acknowledges your imprint on their consciousness. These 5 approaches aren't manipulation tactics. They're pathways to authentic psychological connection. They work because they engage with deeper aspects of human psychology that Jung identified: recognition, shadow integration, growth potential, authentic vulnerability, and meaningful connection. Each morning message that resonates on these levels creates what Jung called numinous experience, a psychological event charged with transformative energy. This isn't obsession in the unhealthy sense, but rather engagement with the whole person, conscious and unconscious. What messages do you send in those quiet morning moments? Do they skim the surface, or do they create space for something deeper to emerge? In Jungian psychology, alchemy serves as a powerful metaphor for transformation, not of lead into gold, but of the fragmented self into wholeness. The morning messages we explored represent the first stage of this psychological alchemy. Now let's examine how these initial communications evolve into something more profound, the creation of psychological space where genuine connection flourishes. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This transformation doesn't happen automatically. It requires what Jung called active imagination, a willingness to engage consciously with the unconscious elements that arise between people. Consider what happens when the first morning message of recognition, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday about your father, that showed real courage," receives a response. The conversation has now entered what Jung would call a temenos, a protected psychological space where deeper work can occur. Many relationships never develop this sacred container. They remain transactional, focused on external matters rather than internal landscapes. But when morning messages consistently acknowledge the inner journey, something shifts. A man becomes not just interested but invested, not just attracted, but psychologically engaged. This engagement manifests in what Jung called inflation and deflation, the natural rhythm of psychological growth. After feeling recognized, man might share something even more vulnerable. If this too is received with understanding, the temenos strengthens. If not, the container cracks, and he retreats to a safer persona. In American culture particularly, men are taught to compartmentalize, to separate emotional life from professional ambition, inner questioning from outer certainty. Jung would describe this as a split between the conscious personality and the anima, the feminine aspect of a man's unconscious. Morning messages that acknowledge both worlds help bridge this divide. I respect how you handled that situation at work, and I also appreciate how you shared your uncertainty about it with me. This kind of communication honors both the external achievement and the internal process, acknowledging what Jung called the tension of opposites that exists within each person. This tension appears in another critical area, the balance between independence and connection. Jung noted that individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, requires both separation and relationship. The most compelling morning communication respects both needs without demanding their resolution. I'm looking forward to hearing about your day later, and I hope your solo project goes well. This message honors both the connection between two people and the separate journey each must take. It demonstrates what Jung called psychological maturity, the ability to hold apparently contradictory truths simultaneously. As these communications continue, they create what Jung termed constellations, patterns of psychological energy that begin to shape experience. A man finds himself thinking of the other person, not just romantically but reflectively. He notices connections between their conversations and his own internal dialogue. The relationship becomes a mirror for parts of himself previously unseen. This mirroring function serves what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to reconcile opposites and generate new, more integrated perspectives. When morning messages consistently engage this function, they create a compelling psychological undertow. The man isn't just looking forward to the next message, he's anticipating the next evolution of himself that the exchange might catalyze. Consider the difference between these two morning messages. "Hope you have a great day" operates on the level of persona. "That dream you shared yesterday made me think about how we both navigate uncertainty" engages the transcendent function. The first message maintains connection but doesn't deepen it. The second creates psychological momentum, an invitation to continue the inner work that the relationship has initiated. This momentum builds through what Jung called active imagination, the process of consciously engaging with symbolic material. Morning messages that continue threads from previous conversations, especially those touching on dreams, aspirations, fears, or memories, activate this faculty. "I was thinking more about that childhood memory you shared. It reminded me of something Jung wrote about how early experiences shape our approach to challenge." This message does something powerful. It places the person's experience within a larger psychological framework, suggesting that their individual story connects to universal patterns. This connection between personal experience and archetypal patterns was central to Jung's work. He believed that recognizing these patterns helps us understand our experiences, not just as random events, but as meaningful chapters in the larger human story. Morning messages that subtly acknowledge this connection create what Jung called amplification, expanding personal experience through archetypal resonance. This isn't about analyzing the other person, but rather about creating context that deepens understanding. The psychological power of these messages doesn't come from their complexity, but from their timing and attunement. Jung wrote extensively about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to reveal a connection between inner and outer worlds. Morning messages that arrive at precisely the moment when they're most needed create this sense of alignment. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check in with you this morning. How are you really doing? When such a message arrives during a moment of uncertainty or transition, it creates what Jung might call numinous experience, an encounter that feels charged with meaning beyond rational explanation. This quality of attunement develops through what Jung called active listening, not just to the words spoken, but to the emotional currents beneath them. As morning messages demonstrate this kind of listening over time, they create psychological safety, the foundation for what Jung termed the process of individuation, or becoming one's complete self in relation to another. I noticed something shifted in your voice when you talked about that project yesterday. I'm here if you want to explore that more. This message communicates not just attention, but attunement, a willingness to accompany the other person into potentially uncomfortable territory. In American culture, where self-reliance is highly valued, the offer of this kind of accompaniment can be especially powerful for men. It acknowledges independence while extending connection, honoring what Jung called the paradox of relationship, where true intimacy requires both closeness and space. The morning messages we've explored create what Jung might call containers for transformation, psychological spaces where growth becomes not just possible, but inevitable. They work not through manipulation, but through invitation, engaging the natural movement of the psyche toward wholeness. The morning breaks differently now. The ping of a message carries with it the potential for something beyond ordinary communication, a doorway into what Jung called the process of individuation. This final exploration takes us deeper into how these morning messages ultimately transform not just connection, but consciousness itself. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This journey toward authentic selfhood, what he termed individuation, paradoxically often accelerates through meaningful relationship. The morning messages we've examined create conditions where this acceleration becomes possible, transforming initial attraction into something more profound, psychological partnership in the journey toward wholeness. In American culture, where relationships are often evaluated through the lens of satisfaction or compatibility, this Jungian perspective offers something revolutionary, the possibility that connections matter not just for what they provide, but for how they transform us. The right morning message doesn't just make someone obsessed, it makes them more themselves. Consider what happens as these messages exchange over weeks and months. Jung would describe this as the constellation of what he called the conjunctio, the alchemical union of opposites within the psyche. This doesn't mean merging identities, but rather allowing the relationship to catalyze integration of previously split aspects of the self. For many men, particularly in contemporary American society, certain qualities remain unconscious or underdeveloped: emotional receptivity, intuitive knowing, comfort with uncertainty. Jung would attribute these to the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche, often projected outward rather than integrated within. Morning messages that acknowledge both strength and sensitivity create space for what Jung called anima integration, the reclaiming of these projected aspects. I appreciate both your decisive action yesterday and your willingness to question whether it was the right move. This kind of communication honors the wholeness that exists beyond conventional masculine stereotypes. This integration process manifests in what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to reconcile seeming opposites and generate new, more comprehensive perspectives. As morning messages engage this function consistently, something remarkable happens. The relationship becomes not just emotionally compelling, but psychologically necessary. Your perspective on this helps me see aspects I couldn't access on my own. This acknowledgement reflects what Jung considered a primary purpose of relationship: to connect us with parts of ourselves that remain unconscious without the mirror of the other. When morning messages consistently provide this mirror, they become essential to the individuation process. The psychological obsession that develops isn't with the person sending the messages, but with the process of becoming that the exchange facilitates. This distinction matters profoundly. Jung warned repeatedly about psychological projection and inflation, mistaking another person for the divinity of the self archetype. Healthy fascination maintains awareness of the difference while honoring the connection. As this awareness deepens, morning messages naturally evolve to engage what Jung called active imagination, conscious dialogue with unconscious material. That dream you mentioned reminds me of what Jung wrote about the shadow. Have you considered what that figure might represent in your own psyche? This kind of message shifts from personal connection to psychological companionship. This companionship creates what Jung termed the container of transformation, a psychological space where previously threatening material can be encountered safely. Many men, conditioned by American culture to associate vulnerability with weakness, find this container particularly valuable. It allows exploration of emotional terrain that might otherwise remain unmapped. I'm holding space for whatever you're processing about your father. There's no rush to have answers. This message demonstrates what Jung called psychological maturity, the capacity to tolerate ambiguity without premature closure. By modeling this tolerance, it invites similar development in the recipient. As this developmental process continues, morning messages begin to engage what Jung described as archetypal patterns, universal motifs that appear across cultures and throughout human history. These patterns provide context for personal experience, connecting individual struggles to collective human questions. What you're describing sounds like what Jung called the night sea journey, that necessary period of darkness before new consciousness emerges. This framing helps transform what might feel like personal failure into a recognized stage of psychological development. It provides what Jung termed amplification, expanding personal experience through archetypal resonance. This resonance creates what Jung called numinous experience, encounters that feel charged with meaning beyond rational explanation. Morning messages that arrive at precisely the moment of need, addressing exactly the question arising in consciousness, generate this quality of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that suggests connection between inner and outer worlds. I woke up thinking about our conversation yesterday, and this quote from Jung seemed relevant to what you're facing. When such a message arrives during a period of questioning or transition, it creates a bridge between conscious concern and unconscious wisdom, what Jung would call the transcendent function in action. As this function operates consistently through morning communication, it develops what Jung termed the symbolic attitude, a perspective that perceives events not just literally, but for their psychological significance. This attitude transforms ordinary experience into opportunity for growth, creating the conditions for what Jung called continued individuation. I noticed how that interaction yesterday seemed to trigger an old pattern for you. I wonder how that connects to what you've been exploring about your childhood. This kind of message demonstrates the symbolic attitude in practice, looking beyond surface behavior to underlying psychological dynamics. This depth of perception creates what Jung described as psychological intimacy, connection that engages not just conscious personality, but the fuller depths of the psyche. For many men in American culture, where relationships often focus primarily on shared activities or physical attraction, this psychological dimension represents uncharted territory. Morning messages that consistently navigate this territory create what Jung called soul connection, relationship that engages not just persona, social mask, or ego, conscious identity, but deeper aspects of the self. This connection manifests in continued curiosity rather than assumption, the hallmark of psychological maturity. I'm curious about how you're integrating that insight from yesterday. No need to have it all figured out. I'm interested in the process. This message demonstrates what Jung considered essential to meaningful relationship, respect for the ongoing nature of psychological development, rather than expectation of fixed conclusions. This respect creates conditions for what Jung called the individuated relationship, connection that supports rather than hinders each person's journey toward wholeness. Morning messages that acknowledge both the value of the connection and the necessity of individual development cultivate this rare quality. I value how our conversations help me understand myself better, and I appreciate how you're pursuing your own questions even when they take you in different directions. This message honors what Jung termed the paradox of relationship, that true intimacy requires both connection and separation. This paradox appears consistently in the individuation process. Jung noted that meaningful development requires both regression, revisiting unresolved material from the past, and progression, moving toward greater consciousness. Morning messages that acknowledge both movements without judgment create psychological safety for this complex journey. I appreciate your honesty about struggling with those old feelings again. That kind of recognition takes courage, and it's part of the path forward. This message demonstrates understanding of what Jung called spiral development, the way psychological growth revisits similar themes at deeper levels rather than proceeding linearly. As morning communication consistently honors this spiral nature, it creates what Jung might call alchemical relationship, connection that catalyzes transformation through repeated cycles of dissolution and reformation. This alchemical quality manifests in messages that acknowledge both progress and ongoing challenge. I see how much you've grown in addressing that pattern, and I also hear the frustration that it still appears sometimes. Both perspectives matter. This balanced acknowledgement reflects what Jung called the holding of tension, maintaining awareness of opposing truths without premature resolution. This capacity to hold tension rather than collapsing into either idealization or devaluation characterizes what Jung termed psychological maturity. Morning messages that demonstrate this maturity create compelling fascination, precisely because they engage with the fullness of human experience rather than simplified versions. The psychological obsession that develops through these messages isn't dependency but recognition, awareness that this connection serves the individuation process in ways that cannot be readily replaced. Jung would describe this as essential relationship, connection that facilitates encounter with the self-archetype, the organizing center of the complete psyche. Our conversation yesterday helped me recognize something I've been avoiding within myself. Thank you for creating space where that could emerge. This acknowledgement reflects what Jung considered the highest purpose of relationship, to serve as catalyst for encountering previously unconscious material. As morning messages consistently serve this purpose, they create what Jung called the alchemical vessel, a contained space where psychological transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. This vessel manifests in communication that balances structure with openness, direction with receptivity. I've been reflecting on what you shared. I have some thoughts when you're ready, but mostly I want to hear more about what you're discovering. This message demonstrates what Jung termed psychological companionship, walking alongside another's process without controlling its direction. This companionship quality creates what Jung might call soul resonance, connection that vibrates at the level of deeper meaning rather than surface compatibility. Morning messages that consistently engage this resonance become compelling because they speak to aspects of self that few other interactions reach. In contemporary American culture, where efficiency and immediate results often dominate the morning, messages we've explored offer something countercultural, invitation into what Jung called temenos time, where psychological development unfolds according to its own rhythm rather than external schedules. I recognize this is a significant realization for you. I'm not expecting quick conclusions. Some insights need time to fully integrate. This message demonstrates respect for what Jung termed the natural timing of the psyche, understanding that meaningful change cannot be rushed. This respect creates conditions for what Jung described as authentic relationship, connection grounded in reality rather than idealization or projection. Morning messages that consistently engage with actual experience rather than romanticized versions build trust in the relationship's capacity to contain truth. I noticed something shifted when you talked about your success yesterday, almost like part of you was uncomfortable with recognition. I'm curious about that whenever you're ready to explore it. This message demonstrates what Jung called shadow awareness, attunement to aspects of self that remain partially unconscious. As morning communications consistently demonstrate this awareness, they create what Jung termed the container for shadow work, psychological space where previously rejected aspects can be reintegrated. This container becomes compelling precisely because it offers possibility for wholeness beyond the fragmentation that many experience. The psychological obsession that develops isn't with another person as object, but with the process of becoming that the relationship facilitates. This distinction represents what Jung would call mature love, connection that serves individuation rather than compensation for unmet developmental needs. The morning messages we've explored create conditions for this maturity by consistently engaging the whole person, conscious and unconscious, strength and vulnerability, certainty and questioning. They work not through manipulation but through invitation into what Jung called the privilege of a lifetime, becoming who you truly are in the context of meaningful connection.